Nadelmann, everyone knows who he is and why he's here, so I don't need to say very much about that. But the executive director of, and there's Knutsen of the Drug Policy Alliance. And we're going to talk now about medical marijuana. And if I can maybe stop and ask something, because I don't like that people are advocating for medical marijuana, because I want cannabis to be legalized. You know, prohibition makes it only worse. It's so awful. It's so immoral, and it's just ridiculous. Yeah. You know. But when someone fights for legalization, when someone fights for decriminalization, and someone fights just for medical marijuana, yeah. I think when it's legal to have it medical, that doesn't solve much. It solves a very, very few with a very nice doctor might get it. Yeah. And still the youth who's using it, they will still use cannabis because it's illegal. Right. So that's kind of a way to be opposite against the society. And the police will still arrest them. They can get cannabis anywhere else. They buy cannabis where they also can get amphetamines and heroin and things like that. Right. So in the society at large, we will have the same situation, and a few will get it as medical. And I've seen in the United States, you can get it for like anything. Hey, I want to, can I get medical marijuana? See, I sleep a little bad. Yeah. Oh yeah! Or I feel a little ill, of course. And then, you know, we have this professor, he tried this, and he said he had to pay $100 to get this recipe for marijuana. And he said, I think I don't need it. $50, you know, you're pushing the marijuana on him. And there's no reason about it.
That's only in California.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But I think, is that a way to start to talk?
So let me start. So let me start by saying two things before I begin to answer your question. The first one is the reason I am here. My first time ever in Oslo was just in May when I was invited by the Oslo Freedom Forum. And then Niels Christian arranged for me to speak at the university, and Lise Recke took me around to see some of the safe injection room and some other places. And I came back this time, however, because this is the first time ever the Norwegian Foreign Ministry is having now their annual meeting of ambassadors, their Norwegian ambassadors. And so they invited me, at the suggestion of, I think, Niels and also Thorvald Stoltenberg, to speak to the Norwegian ambassadors who work in Latin America. And so this morning I was at the Foreign Ministry speaking with the ambassadors, and this is the first time I've ever been invited by a foreign ministry to speak to their diplomats. So it was interesting that, you know, that it would happen, and very promising that it would happen in Norway. The second thing I wanted to say is to introduce you. This is Marcia Rosenbaum, who has been a drug researcher for 30 years. She's written books, a book called Women and Heroin, another book. She got the first federal grant to do research on people who use ecstasy. She wrote a book on pregnant women and drugs. She wrote many articles on the methadone issue. And then she became a leader on the issue of drug education and parents and schools and adolescents, and basically a harm reduction approach to dealing with drugs. And Marcia also has been deeply involved on the medical marijuana issue in California. She lives in San Francisco, I live in New York, so she has a lot of experience and may help to answer some of these questions as well. So, to answer your question, you are partially correct, because the notion of focusing on medical marijuana when the entire prohibition is really illegitimate on its face, and, you know, and counterproductive, has a problem. And also because the fact that marijuana is used medicinally in ways that don't even seem particularly medical, like in California, creates a sense of cynicism. But I'll tell you something. I've been involved in advocating for ending the drug war since the late 1980s. The American public was just champions for the drug war in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in the mid-1990s, when we began to do some public opinion research, what we found was that the first piece of the drug war which a majority of Americans said went too far, was the criminalization of marijuana for medical purposes. So medical marijuana, the discussion had begun in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a remarkable figure named Robert Randall, who sued the federal government for permission and won the right in federal court to get marijuana legally from the federal government. So in the 1980s, the federal government, which grows marijuana on its own farm in Mississippi, mostly for research purposes, began to provide Robert Randall every month with a canister of federal medical marijuana joints. And then dozens of others of people began to get that right as well, right? And many states passed resolutions acknowledging the medical value of marijuana. But then when the war on drugs began, and again in the late 1980s, the federal medical marijuana thing was shut down. The people who already had the right continued to get it, but it was only a small number. And then what happened in 1996 was we had done some research and we saw this was the first issue where a majority of Americans said the drug war has gone too far. And they said marijuana should be legal at least for medical purposes. So some people had drafted a ballot initiative, like a referendum. You know, in the United States, of the 50 states in the United States, roughly half allow the laws to be changed through the process, the initiative, a referendum process, not just through a legislative process. And so I was in a position to raise the money and help lead the campaign to end that. And we won in 1996. The medical marijuana proposal received more votes in 1996 in California than Bill Clinton did in his re-election. And he did very well in California. So it was a big victory. We got 56% of the vote. But here's what was important about medical marijuana. First, it was the first area where we could show public support for rolling back the drug war. Secondly, what it did in the campaign was we changed the public image of who was the marijuana consumer. You know, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, anytime a magazine or newspaper was going to do a story on marijuana, you know, they might interview me or William Buckley or a former police chief or somebody about legalization, but the picture would be of a 17-year-old with blonde dreadlocks and hemp leaves in his hair and the dropout from school conforming to the public image. But now, you know, Marcia recruited a friend of hers who was dealing with cancer. What was her name? Was Judith Kushner, and she became in our television ads, you know, a middle-class mother who was struggling with cancer. And so what happened was people who were older, who were sick, who had cancer, who had multiple sclerosis, who had AIDS, became the image. And they were very sympathetic people. The other thing that happened was we began to bring marijuana from the underground above ground, so that people could see it, and it would be part of the culture, and the sky did not fall, and young people did not all run out to go get marijuana. In other words, it became more normalized. It allowed us, people, before if a state legislature or Congress held a hearing about marijuana, it would always be the experts about marijuana destroys your brain, destroys this, destroys that, the demon drug. And now it became sympathetic people in wheelchairs talking about how marijuana helped them. So it helped to transform the discussion. When people ask, why is it that the support for legalization, broader legalization of marijuana, has increased so rapidly in the United States, so that now the country is divided 50-50, whereas just 15 years ago it was 2-to-1 against, I think in part it's because medical marijuana helped change the dialogue. The other thing, as Marcia said, California, the law was very open, and almost anybody can get it. And if you go down to Venice Beach outside Los Angeles, it's almost the poster child for our opposition, because, as you said, people hawking on the streets, come get a recommendation, anybody can get it. But if you go to New Mexico, or New Jersey, or Vermont, or Rhode Island, or now Delaware, or other states, it's a much more controlled system. You have state medical review boards. They have to agree on which medical conditions. Only a limited number of doctors may do this. It's a much more organized system. And the more organized the system is, the less the federal government is cracking down. So people look at California and they think that's the picture of medical marijuana in America, or what happened in Montana a few years ago. But in fact, it really differs a lot from one state to another. Now you're right, you know, some people said, look, medical marijuana, I thought that was for people with cancer or multiple sclerosis. But I think the way to think about medical marijuana is that there are really three types of medical marijuana patients. One group are the ones who really have cancer and the chemotherapy, the nausea, multiple sclerosis, you know, Parkinson's disease, serious pain, suffering, where marijuana, whether it's smoked or consumed orally, really is the most effective thing for them. And that's a group that almost everybody agrees with, even a majority of Republicans and conservatives. Then there's a second group who use marijuana more or less the way people use sleeping pills or antidepressants, or you know, even to some extent having a beer or a whiskey or something at the end of the day. It's a way of, you know, it's a mild medication. Now, everybody acknowledges that doctors give out sleeping pills, antidepressants, other things, and yet the question that if you use marijuana for the same purpose, it's illegitimate, well, that's not fair. I mean, marijuana is in many respects not as dangerous, less problematic, less addictive than are the sleeping pills and the antidepressants and drugs like that. And then there's a third group, and this is being a little more cynical. But the third group, you know, the public sees pictures of young black and brown men going in and out of the medical marijuana dispensaries, and they say, that's not medical. But part of my response is, you know something, in America, the people who are most likely to be arrested for violating the marijuana law are young men of color. Getting arrested and going to jail is not good for your health. Giving those young men of color a medical marijuana ID, which is basically a do not arrest me card, is good for their health. So it's a cynical way of talking about medical marijuana. But essentially there are now 1 to 2 million Americans, between 1 and 2 million Americans, who have a recommendation from a doctor or an official ID from the state which says, I am a medical marijuana patient, and they cannot be arrested in the state in which they live. And so we are now moving the debate onto the broader decriminalization and legalization, but that's in the West and the East and the North. In the South, we're still just fighting to get medical marijuana.
Thank you.
So what I should tell you is that I and my organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, there are now 17 states that have legalized medical marijuana, plus Washington, D.C. The laws vary dramatically. In New Mexico is one of 2 states, I think, where they allow marijuana to be recommended for PTSD, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And there, something like half of the patients are veterans. So it's we just did a poll in Colorado where there's a legalization initiative on the ballot. And people are very sympathetic to the notion that veterans who have PTSD should be able to get marijuana as medicine.